Most people think the guards don't see them. That's the point, to be honest, and they stand there, 6 feet of pressed wool and polished brass, jaw clenched like they were carved from the same stone as the palace walls. And tourists shuffle past with selfie sticks and bad accents, and nobody thinks. There's a man inside that uniform who has made a decision about every single person in this courtyard, including you, including me. I've spent 11 years writing reports that nobody reads about people, nobody notices. Ceremonial units, palace rotations. The men look in bearskins who don't blink. My colleagues call it the quiet posting. Soft work. Nothing ever happens at a palace, they said. I believed them. Plus, then I watched a royal guard, alone, unarmed for ceremony, post, compromised, radio dead, make a choice that should have been impossible. And when it was over, when the dust settled and the debrief was done, and I was sitting in a room trying to write what I'd seen into language that a committee would understand, I couldn't. Because what I'd watched wasn't procedure. It, to be fair, wasn't training, and it wasn't even courage in any shape I'd been taught to recognize. It was something older than all of that. Heavier. This is what actually happened. The first thing I noticed was the pen. Not the breach in the outer cordon. Not actually. The civilian who'd slipped the visitor lane and was now standing 40 feet inside a perimeter that was, according to every document I'd been handed that morning, impenetrable. Not the 2 SO-14 officers who were both looking at their radios, like the radios had personally offended them. The pen. Guard Sergeant Thomas Ellery was holding a ceremonial pace stick in his left hand, and had, at some point during the last 10 minutes, extracted a biro from God knows where and was rolling it across his knuckles. Slow. Rhythmic. The way you sort of do when your brain is running a calculation it can't show on its face. I'd been sent to Whitehall for what my superintendent cheerfully described as an observation post. Go watch the handover ceremony. Write me 800 words. Nothing happens. You're back by lunch. I had a dictaphone and a lanyard, and the specific misery of a man wearing a suit in October. I was not equipped for what the morning was becoming. The civilian, male, mid-40s, brown jacket, wrong shoes for the weather, had stopped moving. That was the tell. Tourists move, actually. Constantly. They drift, reassemble, drift again, like a slow tide of anoraks. This man had stopped and was watching the guard post with a stillness that made the hairs on my arm stand up before my brain had caught up with why. Ellery had already clocked him. I could tell because the pen stopped rolling. Here, basically, is what I understood about Thomas Ellery in the first 20 minutes of watching him. He was not a large man, which surprised me, given everything I'd been told about the household division's physical benchmarks. He was lean in the way that suggested the weight had been worked off rather than never accumulated. His bearskin sat slightly crooked, a millimeter, or maybe 2, and I'd later learned this was because he'd taken a rifle stock to the left side of his head during a training exercise in 2019, and the ear had never quite sat right again. He'd been offered a medical review. He'd declined it twice. His record, which I was not supposed to have read but had, listed his commendations in the same bureaucratic shorthand used for everything in the ministry. Conduct above expectation. Situation. Fluid. Resolution. Effective. 11 words for 3 separate occasions, where effective had meant something that the families of the people he'd protected used different, larger words for. He didn't look like a man with commendations. He looked like a man who was tired in a specific, load-bearing way. The tiredness of someone who has been standing in the same place for a very long time and intends to keep standing there. The civilian moved again. Northwest, toward the gate. I watched Ellery watch him, The paste stick never moved. The biro was gone. Pocketed or vanished, I couldn't say. His face was doing nothing. His face was doing everything, if you knew where to look. The almost imperceptible tightening at the jaw hinge, the way his eyes had stopped blinking at the normal human rate and were now operating on a different clock entirely. The SO-14 officers were still looking at their radios. What happened next took 11 seconds. I know because I counted them afterward, the way you count when you're trying to make sense of something that your body processed faster than your mind did. Ellery stepped off his post. In 23 years of ceremonial duty, through 6 changes of monarch, through protests and press, and the specific lunacy of 3 consecutive state visits in 1 calendar month, he had, by all accounts, never stepped off his post during active ceremony. And it was the thing about him that other guards mentioned in the way you mention a mathematical constant. Ellery doesn't move. It was a running wager in the guard room. It had become, apparently, something close to institutional mythology. He stepped off his post, and not toward the civilian. I guess toward the left. 4 steps, measured, unhurried, until he was standing beside a stone bollard that had no ceremonial significance whatsoever. Then he stopped and stood at ease and looked, to anyone watching, like a man who had simply repositioned for no particular reason. The civilian's path shifted. He was moving toward the original post now, the empty one, and the place where Ellery had been standing, which was now, and I understood this half a second before it finished happening, directly beneath a CCTV blind spot created by the repositioned media equipment from that morning's press briefing. Ellery's new position had a clean line of sight to it. In my opinion, I stood very still. I had stopped writing. My dictaphone was running, and I was aware of it distantly, the way you're aware of a light left on in another room. The civilian reached the post, looked at it, honestly, looked around. His hand went to his jacket pocket. Ellery said, quietly and without raising his voice, without moving a single visible muscle except his mouth, "I'd leave that where it is, sir." The civilian went still. The SO-14, actually. The officers looked up from their radios. What happened in the 90 seconds after that is in a report I submitted, and which has since been reclassified, so I won't put it here. What I'll say is this: when the man was taken and the cordon reset and the ceremony, impossibly, infuriatingly, Britishly, resumed, Ellery walked back to his post, retrieved the biro from somewhere, and resumed rolling it across his knuckles. One of the younger guards said something to him, low, all under the noise of the crowd. Ellery didn't answer, I think, for a long moment. Then he said, "It was the shoes." The other guard looked confused. I wasn't confused. Plus, wrong shoes for the weather meant he hadn't walked to the palace. He'd come another way. He'd been planning to come another way back. A man who intends to leave through the visitor gate doesn't need an exit that doesn't exist on any map. Sort of, I wrote that down. And then I stood there, with the October cold eating through my suit jacket, watching Thomas Ellery hold a ceremonial position in front of a building that contained people whose safety was, in some bureaucratic sense, partially my responsibility. And I thought about what it cost a man to stand still long enough to see the things that other people miss. The ceremony ended at 11:30, precisely on schedule. Ellery didn't, in my opinion, look at me once. I got to be fair, and the feeling that was also deliberate. They put me, actually, in a room with Ellery at 1400. Not an interview room, a side office off the main corridor, the kind that smells like radiator dust and old carpet, and the specific institutional sadness of a building that was important before anyone currently living was born. There was a tray with 2 cups of tea on it. Tea was the color of a motorway in rain. Ellery sat across from me with his bearskin off, which made him look, disconcertingly, like a regular person. His hair was close-cropped and going gray at the temples, in a pattern that looked less like aging and more like being worn down from the outside in. There was a scar on his left forearm that stopped just before the wrist, not a clean line, the kind that comes from something that had time to change direction. He hadn't touched his tea. I had my notepad, open, which I had 7 questions prepared. I asked none of them. What I said was, "The shoe thing, and how long did it take you to notice?" He looked at me with the specific patience of a man who has been asked the wrong question many times by many people with notepads. "Before he stopped moving," he said, and I wrote that down. Then I stopped kind of writing and looked at him. "That's fast." "Look, it's not fast," he said. "You just spend enough time watching people walk the same route that when someone walks it wrong, it's the loudest, taught thing in the room." He said it the way you say something. True that you've stopped expecting people to understand. I asked him about the repositioning, the blind spot, whether that was a standing protocol, a pre-planned contingency, something from a training manual I hadn't been given access to. He picked up his tea, put it down again without drinking. "No," he said, and one word, complete sentence. No elaboration look offered, none incoming. I'm a patient man, professionally, if not by temperament, so I waited. The radiator ticked, which somewhere down the corridor a door opened and closed. Ellery looked at a point on the wall, approximately 6 inches above my left shoulder. The way people look when they're not avoiding your eyes, but when they're watching something you can't see. "You know what the post is for?" he said, finally. I said I did. Ceremonial presence, for what it's worth, plus deterrence through visibility. A signal, as much as a function. "Why, it's a fixed point," he said. "Everything about it is fixed, which the position, the stance, the sight lines, the distance from the gate. All of it fixed. All of it known." He paused. "Which means, I guess, anyone who's done their homework knows exactly where I'm not looking." I understood then what he'd done. He hadn't broken protocol, and he'd used the protocol, the absolute predictability of his own position, as bait. Made the post the most obvious, readable, same expected thing in the courtyard. Then moved to the place that the post's rigidity had always, necessarily, left uncovered. He'd used the ceremony as a trap. I asked him how long he'd been thinking about that particular blind spot. Something moved, I guess, across his face. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it, in the way that the cold edge of a knife is adjacent to warmth. "Which one?" he said. The debrief that afternoon ran 3 hours. I sat in the back and took notes on the notes other people were taking, which is the specific indignity of my particular job. The SO-14 officers were thorough and professional and explained their radio failure with the calm of people who have already written the self-critique in their own heads and are delivering a pre-edited version. Ellery sat at the table and answered questions in the same short, gravitational way he'd answered mine. Yes and no. To be fair, approximately. I'd have to check the log. At one point, a senior officer asked whether Ellery had been uncertain about the call to reposition. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a question has landed on something real. Ellery, I guess, looked at his hands on the table. His hands were very still. He kept them that way when he was thinking, I'd noticed. A stillness so deliberate it had weight. Sort of. "No," he said. "Not even, no." But I'd watched his face when the man's hand went to his jacket pocket. And what I'd seen, for one fragment of a second, before everything became procedure and response. And aftermath was not certainty. It was something harder than certainty. The thing on pretty much the other side of it. The thing you, to be fair, arrive at when you've already made the decision before the situation required it. In some cold, a private internal accounting that happened long before this morning, and possibly long before this posting. I didn't write that in my report. Plus, some things don't survive translation into the language of committees. It was Ellery's colleague, a private named Osei, who told me the rest of it. Not because he was indiscreet, and he wasn't. He told me because he'd watched me watching Ellery all afternoon, and had, apparently, decided I was trying to understand something rather than merely document it. He had a kid in the hospital last week, Osei said. We were standing in the corridor outside the debrief room, sharing a silence that had the shape of a conversation. Nothing critical, but he drove back from the hospital at 4 a.m. and was at his post at 6. I didn't say anything. He never told anyone, which I only know because I saw the car park ticket in his kit bag, a dated Tuesday. The debrief had been on Wednesday. I thought about the biro rolling across the knuckles, the specific, rhythmic, metronomic quality of it. The thing you do when your hands need something to manage so your face doesn't have to. Does he know you know? I asked. Osei looked at me. Of course he does. He walked back toward the guard room, and I stood in the corridor under a strip light that was one stage removed from completely giving up. And I thought about the particular arithmetic of a man who drives back from a hospital in the dark, sleeps maybe 90 minutes on a cot somewhere, buttons himself into a uniform that weighs 11 kilograms with full kit, and goes to stand in a fixed position in a cold courtyard for 6 hours because the position needs to be filled, and he's the one who fills it. Not because he's been ordered to, because he can't imagine being the reason the post is empty. When I took out my dictaphone and turned it off. There was nothing on the recording I was going to use. I saw him once more before the posting rotated. It was 4 days later, a Thursday, the specific gray of a London Thursday that makes you feel like the sky has simply stopped trying. I wasn't, there officially. I told myself I'd taken a different route to the tube. I'm a bad enough liar that I don't even convince myself anymore. So I'll spare you the attempt. He was at his post. Of course he was. The tourists had no idea what had happened 4 days ago in this courtyard. Look, why would they? The day had been smoothed over, resealed, returned to its ceremonial surface, like a floor that had briefly been lifted and then set back down. The media equipment was gone. The cordon was normal. 2 children near the gate were fighting over a guardsman hat from the gift shop in that violent, passionate way that children fight over objects they'll discard before the end of the afternoon. I stood in the visitor area and watched Ellery not move for 20 minutes. This is the thing nobody tells you about the guards. Not the physical toll of it, though that's real. The standing, the weight, the cold that has opinions about your skeleton. The thing for what it's worth, nobody tells you, is what it costs to be a fixed point in a world that is always in motion. To be the thing that doesn't react, which to watch people, thousands of them, every rotation, every week, every year, and hold every observation inside yourself because the job requires stillness, and stillness requires that the inside and the outside operate as 2 entirely separate systems. Ellery had been doing this for 11 years. Not the standing, the separation. A woman stopped near me, American by the accent. She was telling her husband to take a photo, and her husband was fumbling with his phone with the specific defeated energy of a man who has been asked to take photos all week and has made peace with his own inadequacy. She watched Ellery for a moment. Plus, something in her face changed. Not dramatically. The way faces change when they've seen something that doesn't fit the shape they expected. "Do you think he's real?" she asked. Not to me. To her husband, half to herself. Her husband, I think, took the photo. They moved on. I stayed. And here basically is what I put in my final report. Guard Sergeant Thomas Ellery proved exemplary situational awareness and rapid tactical repositioning in response to an identified threat actor during the ceremonial handover on the 14th. His response was proportionate, effective, and conducted without disruption to the ceremonial schedule. Recommend commendation review. 11 words. Different 11 words than the ones in his existing record, but the same shape, the same cabinet drawer. And here is what I didn't put in my report. That after the debrief, after Osei's corridor confidence, after all the formal language had been applied, the incident boxed and filed, I'd gone back to my car and sat in it for 15 minutes without starting the engine. I'm not a sentimental man. I've been doing this long enough that sentiment is a liability I can't afford in the volume it once wanted to exist in me. I've attended 3 separate funerals for people I briefed in the week before they died. I've written, actually, reports that described, in bloodless administrative shorthand, things that were neither bloodless nor short. I've, on one occasion, been in a room where a decision was made and known it was wrong. Said nothing, and carry that with me in the specific way you carry something that doesn't have a shape. So when I, to be fair, I tell you that I sat in my car outside a government building in the October cold because I'd watched a man stand perfectly still while quietly saving lives he'd never be allowed to claim, you'll understand that this isn't nothing for me. You'll understand what it costs to say, I hadn't expected to be moved. The last thing Osei told me as I was signing out at the gate. He asked about your report, whether you'd got what you needed. I looked up. What did you tell him? That you'd been writing for 3 days and looked like you hadn't slept. I signed my name, handed back the lanyard. What did he say? Osei almost smiled. He said, "Good. That means he's thinking about it right." I gotta say, I've been thinking about it right ever since. There's a, I think, question I didn't ask Ellery in that side office with the radiator dust and the 2 untouched cups of tea. No, I've replayed the conversation enough times to know it's the one that mattered, which is probably why I didn't ask it. I wanted to know whether he was frightened. Not then, not in the moment. I already knew the answer to that version of the question, which was irrelevant. The decision was already made. I wanted to know whether he was frightened in the way I suspect people like Ellery are frightened. Not of the thing happening, but of the day it finally doesn't. The day the post is empty and nobody fills it. The day the careful arithmetic of a man who drives back from hospital at 4 in the morning and arrives at his post at 6 finally comes up short. I didn't ask. He probably would have given me 1 word. But I've been writing the answer he didn't give me for 4 days now, and I'm still not done. The tourist woman's voice keeps coming back to me. Do you think he's real? Not the question she thought she was asking. Entirely the right question. I drove back to Whitehall this morning. Different route, different excuse, same destination, and the handover ceremony was already in progress when I arrived. Different guards, different faces under the bearskins. I scanned the line anyway. Somewhere in the building behind the gate, in a corridor that smells like radiator dust, there's a room with a tea tray in it. 2 cups, probably cold by now. One of them was never touched. That detail is actually in no report I've filed. I don't know why I keep thinking about it. I don't know why I'm still here.